My name's Emil Daubon. I'm a writer and military technical advisor on Ghost Recon Breakpoint. I've served in Special Forces for over almost 15 years.
Okay. Hey guys, Gabriel here from Serial Killers. We're at the Breakpoint preview event in Berlin. And yeah, let's start the questions. So the first question, after playing the game, your main focus seems to be, again, realism, authenticity. Could you give us any details? How was working with the team, bringing the background you have into the game, into the characters of the game, the realism of the guns?
Sure. So the emphasis on realism and authenticity is more about finding a balance between authenticity and immersion in the fantasy. Oftentimes real details or real tactics don't work within the context of a game or within the framework for a variety of reasons, whether it's cinematic viability or coding constraints or programming. And really the trick and my job as a technical advisor is to help the directors and the core team's vision sort of be realized within the realm of authenticity. So it's more about sort of lending details, realistic details and authentic details to heighten the fantasy. And in that respect, I mean, I was able to work with almost every department. My primary focus is as a writer. And so within narration, writing, systemic voices, optional dialogues, missions, I was able to bring a lot of my experience from the military to bear on that process, but for the sake of writing the story. And then, of course, for advising, I was working with pre-visualization and the animators and the realization team to help their animations or their cinematics feel more authentic, if that makes sense.
Could we jump to gunplay? Like, I think you have a bit of experience with that.
I am familiar with firearms.
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Could you describe how video games or Ghost Recon Breakpoint feel to, like, compared to real combat situations and real guns?
That's a great question. Remembering that this is a fantasy, there's only so much that we can do with a video game to give the sort of the sense of real firearms. And of course, a lot of work goes into the animations and the feedback through the paddle so that the gunplay has more of a feeling of authenticity and realism. So whether it's recoil of the weapon system, or whether it's reloading time, magazine changes, or whether it's how that rifle sights, how the optics work, the teams worked really hard to bring more details of actual sort of authentic firearms into the game so that they perform a little bit more like a real firearm. It's really difficult to give that sense, again, through a paddle. Nothing feels quite the same as holding a firearm. But the way that the weapons interact with enemy, the way that they interact with you as a player, they're pretty close. Again, it's difficult to really capture the feeling of gunplay, of firearms in a game. But a lot of the details that we work to heighten, again, whether it's how the optics work or how they perform or how how quickly the weapon reloads, it's an authentic feel.
Okay. Do you play video games yourself, or?
I do. Interestingly, I hadn't played games for years, and then I started to work on this project, and I started to play again so that I could have a better understanding of the constraints of writing for video games versus writing for film and television. And as a result, I now find that I play very often. So I've been playing a lot for the last year and change. Yeah. So
you mentioned television, TV shows. What's the biggest difference working on with video game developers, or especially video games, compared to TV shows?
There are additional constraints when it comes to a video game that you don't necessarily consider when you're writing for the screen. Things like the coding and the programming, or the overarching narrative vision. So it's there's a lot of similarities. At least for myself, my writing process didn't change that much when it came to writing for the game. But oftentimes things that I would write, particularly in systemic writing, has to fit very specific programming parameters. It has to fit within the context of the scene. It has to fit with the actual systems that are being developed. And that's something that's an interesting challenge that you don't face when you're writing for the screen. You write a conversation and that's it. If you're talking about AI within the game interacting with the player, now you have to figure how are you going to trigger the initiation of the conversation. How is that going to trigger a response? Do you have a sufficient database of questions and answers or initiations and responses? Do they fit together? Do they work? Do they fit the context? Do they fit the character and the tone? There's a lot more constraints, and I find that mostly they came down to like technical constraints that just aren't a consideration when you're writing for screen. But at the same time, those challenges make it more immersive when you're writing. So what you might maybe lose in simplicity, and I say simplicity, it's not easy to write for the screen, but those additional technical constraints make it really challenging for games. I found it immersed me more in the writing process, so it was more fun at times. Even when you're writing barks for a game can become repetitive. Yeah. But when you're really trying to make it fit with a multi-tiered system, it actually becomes really engaging. So it's not easier or harder, it's different. But I found that technical constraints, I think, were the biggest difference between the two.
Could you go back to the realism parts? What would you say are the biggest challenges when you implement real army Navy SEAL scenarios or the gunplay to video games?
I mean, interestingly, the technical constraints play a big role again. Oftentimes real tactics either don't look good, aren't enjoyable or entertaining, to watch, or they just don't fit the programming. A lot goes into how these animations work, and the coding ends up dictating a lot of the content that you can or can't create. So as an advisor, it really comes down to us to find ways to make what is functional or viable within the context of the coding and the programming feel authentic. So it's, again, we really work on injecting details of realism that allow whatever the programming sort of develops to feel more authentic.
In the presentation, there was Rodney Mullen mentioned, I think. How did that come together?
Honestly, I'm not sure how he was picked for that role. It's really cool. I mean, he did a fantastic job. The character they created is really nuanced and, very intriguing. I wasn't around when a lot of the casting was done. I came on the project a little bit later, so I wasn't there from the sort of core development. And by the time I came on board, a lot of the linear narrative had already been written and locked. So Rodney's lines were already written. The casting had been done. And I kind of wish I knew, because he was a very interesting choice. Yeah. And when I first heard about it, I was like, oh, Rodney Mullen, cool. Weird, but cool. and it was amazing. Yeah. It was amazing. I got to see a lot of the sort of B-roll and behind-the-scenes footage of the mocaps with Rodney. I was like, man, this guy is awesome. So just one of those cool things. I'm sure somebody could give you a much more detailed answer about how he was chosen. I'm just super glad that he was and excited to be part of it.
Yeah. So as final question, what is your most favorite part of the whole development process behind Ghost Recon Breakpoint? What is the feature that you really want people to see, to feel, to experience?
I am tremendously biased. I'm a writer first and foremost, and I think the narrative that we were allowed to create for this installment in Ghost Recon is really immersive. We were given a lot of freedom to expand on the narrative experience because the core team felt that the only way to improve on the experience, the fantasy of being a ghost, is to create a much more sort of immersive, a deeper narrative. And they gave us a lot of room to play with the narration. And truthfully, I think the story is what's most compelling. I prefer sort of solo gameplay. I love deeply immersive narratives, and I think we've achieved something pretty great with this story.
Awesome. Thanks again for your time.
My pleasure.